Hello, folks, and welcome back to World War II, Part 2. We had just finished talking about the road to war in both Germany and Japan, and had gotten started on an overview of the war. We're on Part 3 because, dang, it's a long war. World War II is definitely longer than World War I if you go from the start date of 1939. It's not necessarily longer for the United States, but it's longer for sort of everybody else in the long run. So, okay, it's a long war. Now, there are some successes. In 1942, the Allies, again, the Allies are the United States, Russia, and the United Kingdom, get sonar. Sonar is sound and navigation ranging, I think is what it stands for. But basically, it's like echolocation for bats. Bats are cute. Except humans do it. Here's our bat. I'm a bat and I'm cute. There's our bat. I love bats. Bats are so cute. The Allied air forces also start targeting Germany's economic resources. So again, this is another example of total war. Total war has several meanings. Total war can mean that all the citizens are invested. So everybody is helping out and everybody is pulling together, but also citizens are casualties. When I say citizens, I actually mean civilians. Civilians, for those of you who don't know, now I can't think if there's one or two L's. Civilians. I'll double check and leave a space just in case, because I can't remember. Civilians are non-military personnel. So, old people, children. I don't think there's two. Yeah, there's only one L. Whoo, thank goodness. Civilians. So, again, you have military personnel and then you have civilians, and civilians are non-military personnel. So, the Allied air forces start targeting Germany's economic resources in broad daylight. This does result in civilian casualties. It has good accuracy for the air forces, but high casualties because the German defense can see them better to shoot at them more effectively. In North Africa, we have some stuff going on in there too. Italy attacks Egypt in 1940, before the United States is involved. Britain fighting back, which is a 2-year back and forth between Italy and Britain. There's also a very famous general on the German side called Rommel. He's known as Desert Fox, and he's up against Dwight D. Eisenhower, who is the American general eventually, and eventually president. I like Ike. And Eisenhower is responsible for a lot of Allied successes. So when he runs for president, he's a war hero, and they're all thrilled. Now, when Eisenhower eventually wins, this means that they can sneak up to Italy from North Africa and try and take them, not really by surprise, but it's easier to take them. So, North Africa, everything is deserty and terrible. It's just because it's like nothing but sand and rocks, and the camels are fun, I'm sure, but does that look like a camel? No. Okay, so sidebar to the Pacific. It's kind of hard to fit Japan into this PowerPoint and the Pacific Theater. So we have the Western Theater, and then we have the European Theater and the Pacific Theater. The Pacific Theater is the war in Japan, the South Pacific. So the U.S. eventually does have an advantage because they break the Japanese code, and the Japanese are never able to break the U.S.'s code because of the Navajo code talkers. Woo! Unfortunately, this comes at quite a price for the Navajo, but we'll talk about that in a second. Navajo originally is a difficult language anyways. It's hard to pronounce. There's a lot of interesting sort of vowel combinations and stuff like that. Navajo is just sort of a difficult language if you're not a native speaker. But then also, the Navajo would then put things into code into Navajo. So if we're talking about, like, turtles were code names for, like, aircraft carriers. So even if the Japanese figured out that they were talking about turtles, they might not necessarily figure out that they're talking about aircraft carriers. Now, this actually was very bad in a lot of ways for the Navajo code talkers and for the Navajo Nation in general, because they took a lot of the young people away from the reservation to do this, and a lot of them did die. So that's knowledge lost. Secondly, the United States didn't want anybody infiltrating the Navajo Nation and learning all of this stuff and all of the language and their secrets and things like that. So the US government burned all of the books in Navajo except for the Bible, and essentially created a huge loss of knowledge on the Navajo Nation. Plus, lots of people were still racist to the Navajo after the war. Before the war too, but definitely after the war as well. And so, like, there's stories of Navajo military veterans who were only treated well if they were in uniform, but if they were out of uniform, they were treated very, very poorly. And segregation is still going on during this time period. And if you're somewhere like Arizona, there really aren't that many black people in Arizona at this time. There are black people, but there really aren't that many black people as compared to Native Americans or Hispanic people. And so the segregation laws in Arizona mostly applied to other people of color rather than necessarily just black people. And Asians, there was a pretty solid Chinese American community in Phoenix and Tucson as well. So again, even though the Navajo code talkers helped us win against Japan significantly, because it was crucial that that code was not broken, in a lot of ways the Navajo were betrayed. In a lot of ways. Okay? When the Americans win the Battle of Midway and capture Guadalcanal, then the Japanese have to be on the defensive for the rest of the war. But it's incredibly difficult because the Americans have to do what's called island hopping. And island hopping is legitimately, we have to conquer one island at a time. And they attacked cargo ships as well, but like, so you have all of these islands hanging out here in the South Pacific, and you literally are having to, like, tick them off one at a time. And a lot of times, this was really, really hard to do because you're coming out of the water. Usually, islands are kind of sort of like this, so you're trying to fight up a little bit. In a lot of these islands, there were caves in which people were hiding. And you had to make sure that you went through all the caves and you found everybody, and not everybody was found. Plus, now we're seeing that the Japanese are starting to get a little desperate because they're running out of supplies, because the Americans are attacking these cargo ships. So they're beginning to run out of supplies, they're beginning to start losing the war, and they're starting to turn to really desperate measures. So the Japanese are starting to use kamikaze warfare, and kamikaze warfare is essentially when you don't have enough fuel to get all the way to your target and back. So you fuel up just enough to get to your target, and then you have your boat, your American boat or whatever, and then your plane, and you just crash your plane into the boat and try to do damage to the boat. This was a really horrific, gnarly process, and a lot of times these pilots were very young men who were kind of starry-eyed, wanted to join the military, wanted to fly a plane, and then this was the kind of stuff that they were being asked to do. So the Battle of Okinawa, the Japanese kamikazes do a lot of damage to the Allied ships, but the Allies eventually defeat Japan. And then Truman eventually decides that he does not want to invade Japan proper. Now, this is quite a controversial issue still. Okay, because Truman thought that if they invaded Japan, they would have to not only invade Japan proper, and that would take a lot of people and a lot of manpower, a lot of bullets, and a lot of lives, but that then they would have to go in and specifically squash out the Japanese holdings in Korea, and Manchuria and all of those other sort of holdings around Asia. So one line of thinking and one line of reasoning that people use to excuse the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that the loss of life here would have been more than had we dropped the 2 nuclear bombs. Now, there is no way to prove that. You can't do that. You can't say, like, oh, we tried it both ways, and here were the... You can't do that. It's an either-or situation, so we will never really know if that is a legitimate thing or not. What we do know, though, is that 70 to 90,000 people died instantaneously when they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, and 40 to 75,000 died instantly in Nagasaki. Also, many more die from nuclear radiation effects by the end of 1945, and also long-term, the cancer rates in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were exponential for decades and decades and decades. And it's irresponsible. And we didn't have a great idea of what all of these things were going to do to people as the United States and the people who... I was not there, so I need to stop using the word we. But the United States had no real good idea. We had an idea. Sorry, the United States had an idea. We had been testing... Oh my goodness, it is so hard not to do that. The United States had been testing nuclear weapons and had a reasonable idea of what level of destruction they were going to cause. But things like cancer and the effects of radiation, I don't think that the United States really 100% understood exactly what the long-term effects of that were. I don't think it would have changed... I don't know. I have absolutely no idea. I don't know if it would have changed their choices or not. But it was a gnarly, gnarly situation, and it's horrifying. It is just straight up horrifying. To date, Japan is the only country that has had a nuclear bomb dropped on them in times of war. And nobody has used a nuclear weapon against another country. So far, there has only been testing and sort of threatening of nuclear bombs to be used and atomic bombs and stuff like that. But it's just one of those things that's... It's just horrifying. It really is. It's just absolutely horrifying. So here's a picture of Guadalcanal. That was earlier in the PowerPoint as well. Here is a picture from Iwo Jima. This is the really famous one of the Marines raising the flag. I seem to remember it being pretty intense, but Clint Eastwood actually made a series of movies about World War II, and I actually have only seen one of them, but I highly recommend it. It was very upsetting, and it shows mostly the Japanese perspective of what was going on with the island hopping, and it's called Letters from Iwo Jima. But it is very intense, and I remember mostly just sobbing through the whole movie in the movie theater. So just FYI, it's definitely rated R for violence and things like that, and I just remember crying the whole time. So, FYI. Okay. Here's another picture of the Allied forces attacking the islands. These islands are really not a whole heck of a lot of anything either, because they're mostly just little cinder cone kind of things, oceanic volcanoes, and so it's like volcanic cinders everywhere, and it's gross. Nothing really lives there, and blech. More island hopping pictures. Blech. More island hopping pictures. Look at that. Oh, look at that sand. It's not even sand. It's literally cinders. Have you ever tried to run up like a cinder hill or something like that? It's literally the worst thing ever. I have never been so dirty as when we played Capture the Flag on the cinder hills for cross country. Blah, disgusting. Here are a bunch of Allied soldiers holding up a war prize. One of the things that in basically every war all soldiers tend to do is to take prizes from the people that they've killed or they've captured. So helmets, flags, personal effects. So here is a Japanese flag, which looks like a lot of times what they used to do is if your little village was sending somebody off to war, they would have people write good luck notes or messages or things of that nature on a flag or something like that and send it with them as sort of like a totem or a token of luck. And so this is one of those flags that they have taken, probably off of a dead body. And everybody did that. So it's not like it's just the Allied forces. This is Little Boy. This is the atomic bomb that was dropped in Hiroshima. And now, technically, the Americans did warn the Japanese. They dropped pamphlets that were like, hey, you should get out of the city. We're gonna come and do stuff. But a lot of the people didn't take it seriously, and nobody had ever actually seen a nuclear bomb dropped on an actual human population before. So nobody had any genuine idea what was actually going to happen. There's the mushroom cloud. If you are closest to the center, you are vaporized instantly. A little bit further out, and you're usually still vaporized, but oftentimes you leave atomic shadows, which is also really, really horrifying. And it did things like cause the rivers to catch on fire and buildings to instantaneously collapse with everybody in them and people who had radiation poisoning. Radiation poisoning results in things like your skin peeling off. It's horrifying. So here's a picture of the destruction. Just all of those buildings just leveled. This is Fat Man. This is the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. They dropped it 3 days later because Japan had not yet surrendered. Take that as you will. And here's the mushroom cloud from Nagasaki. Again, this is a really complicated thing, and people get very heated over these ideas and concepts. It's very personal to a lot of people, and a lot of people take it very personally and think that, if you say something like, we shouldn't have dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a lot of times people take it really personally and think that you're anti-American or something like that. And that's not the case. You can be pro-American and still be against having dropped the nuclear bombs on Japan. So I believe this is in Nagasaki today. It's a memorial to the lives that were lost as part of the bombings. Both Hiroshima and Nagasaki have rebuilt today, and people do still live there. There are shrines and other things, memorials to the victims there, and it is still a very profound thing that has happened, and it echoes in the memories of the people who live there and all around Japan. I had one other thing that I was going to say about that. Yes. The other thing, too, is that they picked Nagasaki because they wanted to see what would happen when they dropped a bomb inside a ring of mountains. Turns out what happens is it reverberates and it, triples the damage. Okay. Continuing on. That was really depressing. All of this is really depressing, though, except for, occasional successes and when Hitler commits suicide. It's really depressing. So in 1943, the Allies land in Italy, and if you are ever interested, again, it's a little bit rated R at this point for you, but later, I highly recommend reading the book Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. It is a comedy, which sounds really funny, and if you read it and you don't realize it's a comedy, it's a little confusing, and you're like, I'm supposed to be laughing at this book? Yeah, you are, actually. And it is a little R-rated, so I would maybe wait a couple of years. And I also would recommend, hopefully you read it in a literature class so that somebody helps walk you through it to get all of the jokes and all of the nuances. It's a really great book. I read it my senior year in high school, and very, very interesting. Now, the Italians are really tired of losing, of being fascists, and they're tired of Mussolini. Mussolini is mostly in it for the glory. He's not really a great, competent leader. So they overthrow Mussolini themselves. And then Hitler steps in to save Mussolini and just takes over Italy because Mussolini is like, I don't really want to do this anymore. They send Mussolini off to a Swiss ski resort for a year. And he's just sitting at a lakeside being like, I don't want to rule Italy. And Hitler's, over there facepalming oh my God, Mussolini, get it together. Hilarious. Except people are dying and fascism is bad. Oh, I just drew on my nose with my pen. Oh well. They slow down the Allies because Hitler pushes a bunch of forces into Italy, but pushing a bunch of forces into Italy means that he has to withdraw fighters from Russia. So that means that he starts losing Russia because he's now in like a three-front war kind of a thing. And the Allies eventually capture Rome in June 1944. And I should have put pictures in it. Maybe I'll add them for the next time. But when we were in Rome last year for the trip that we went on for the International Club, we saw places that had bullet holes in them from when the Allies stormed into Rome. And it was really, really interesting and heartbreaking to see those. Italian resistance fighters eventually capture and kill Mussolini in April 1945 because they are so done with him. The Allies eventually drive the Germans out of Italy in May 1945, and Italy has been liberated. The Allies start to push forward some more. Hitler had to withdraw forces in Russia to fight the Allies in Italy and then eventually loses it. D-Day gives the Allies a foothold in France. So if you don't know, there are several things that are pretty important during this time period. For example, when the Germans began invading France. So we have France, we have Englandish, Ireland, England. This is the English Channel over here. And when Germany started invading France, everybody was pushed to this coast. And there was a huge rescue effort mounted from England where literally anybody who had a boat that was on this side of England was sailing across the English Channel to desperately try and pick up any troops that they could from the French coast. And that, it showed them that they could do that. So the Allies were like, aha, what if we go from England to France and storm the beaches of Normandy, because Germany had then taken over France. So they went ahead and they did that, and that is what is called D-Day, is that landing on the beaches of Normandy. Spearheaded by Eisenhower again, and they landed at a whole bunch of different beaches along that northern coast of France to try to unseat the Germans. They were ultimately successful, but it was a gnarly fight, and many people were killed because, again, they're coming out of the ocean to the Germans who have guns and ammunition and artillery set up on the beaches, and it was really a hard thing. Fortunately, they did have some help because they had parachuted in people into the interior in France, who then came and sort of got behind the Germans. If you are interested in that, there is a, again, sort of rated R miniseries called Band of Brothers. That's about those parachuter guys. Very interesting. And also, the opening sequence of Saving Private Ryan is storming the beaches of Normandy. Again, this is very R-rated for violence, especially Saving Private Ryan is super realistic, even though it was like the late 90s when they made this. And I remember watching this movie with my dad for the first time in college and being horrified by the violence that was taking place on the screen, and I knew that it was simulated violence, and I was still absolutely horrified. The Battle of the Bulge allows the Allies to start liberating France. We will talk a little bit more about the Yalta Conference and the last section of the war in the next lecture. For today, I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, despite the fact that we've had to talk about all these depressing things. Sorry. Use this knowledge to help make the world a better place. You can do it. I believe in you. Okay. Take care. Bye.